Could you imagine waking up one morning and being told that tomorrow you're going to be the king? How awesome would that be? That the prophet of God comes to visit you, looks you dead in the eye, and says, hey, you, tomorrow I'm going to anoint you to be the king or queen of all the land. Wouldn't that be pretty cool? Well, it would be pretty cool unless you're David, who as a young boy was anointed to be the king, and then the very next day he ends up standing in front of a 9 feet 9 inch giant. Then the very next day he ends up having spears and javelins thrown at him, and then the very next day he ends up running for his life from his mentor, the one that he's going to replace, King Saul. Now, a lot of times in our lives we face these scenarios where everything seems to be pointing us in one direction. It's like our calling is gripping us. We're riveted to the reality that we're about to be something great, and then it all just falls apart. It's like nothing ever works out. I'm called to be the king. Yes. So now there's crowns, and there's breastplates, and there's majesty and prestige and giants and javelins and caves. That doesn't make any sense. Actually, before David ever became the king, he became a dead man walking. You've read the story. We've all seen it. All through 1 Samuel, all the way through 2 Samuel. We know exactly what happened. David was anointed to become the king, and then the challenges began. He was just as good as a dead man walking. Everywhere he turned, there was tragedy, there was trial, and there was never any triumph. Yet David is the same guy who says in the 23rd Psalm that God prepares a table for him in the presence of his enemies. I want to point something out to you. David eventually came back from the dead, but David had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And David had to learn that he couldn't fear the evil that was all around him. What he had to know is that while he may have been a shepherd to some sheep, he may have fought off lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. He may have killed a giant. He may have darted out of the way of spears. While living in a cave, he may have usurped King Saul's plans to completely and totally destroy him. But the truth of the matter is, it had nothing to do with David. Let's break down that 23rd Psalm to understand exactly how David came back from the dead. You see, the first thing he points out is the valley of the shadow of death. Although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Now, he's not walking through the valley of death. God will never take you and place you in the valley of death. You may have to walk through the shadow of it. You may have to walk around it. You may have to see it in a distance, and it may even get close to you. It may be very, very scary, and I understand that completely. But here's the fact of the matter. Although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me. You see, when David was tending his sheep, and the lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, came along, he was basically a dead boy walking. There was no way that David could ever overcome the might and the strength of the jaws of a bear or the pounce of a tiger or a lion. There's nothing that David could have done unless, while he was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, God was with him. You see, when David stood up against Goliath, there was nothing that David could do. He was a defeated foe. The text indicates to us perfectly that David was just a boy and Goliath was a warrior from his youth. Yet he was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and he didn't fear the evil because God was with him. Through the javelins and the hiding in caves, he didn't fear the evil because he understood that God was with him. The end of the story is David is anointed the king. He becomes the man that he was called by God to be. And that's where the truth of this teaching comes in. You got to realize that even in the middle of your calling, you're going to face the shadow of death. You're going to face the negativity that is all around you. There are going to be constant voices that tell you you cannot accomplish the goals that are set before you. The fact is, David faced that right before he stood in front of Goliath. His brother came to him and said, "What are you, a child? Are you so cocky that you think you can defeat this monster of a man?" David understood that the voice of negativity was not the voice of truth. David could sense that there was something bigger, and that's why he stood against Goliath and said, "It's not by sword or by spear or by this sling and these stones that the Lord God saves, but it is by his power and it is by his might. I won't be killing you, Goliath, but God will be working through me." And here's the interesting factor that needs to be noted. David goes on to say, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, consider this. Every single time that a king in ancient days would take over a territory or a land, they would put the king of that land under their rule, under their dominion. And those kings would present themselves sitting at a lower place at the current king's table. It was almost as if David understood that through the power of God, he had conquered kingdoms, and that the lesser things that said that he could not be would be sitting in a lower position watching him feast on the goodness of God. What you've got to realize is that, yeah, you may have thought that you were dead because of the words and actions of others. The reality is that people have hurt you. I know it because I felt that pain myself. Maybe it was relatives. I felt that pain myself. Maybe it was coworkers. I felt that pain. Maybe it was your boss. David felt that pain when he was a human target. But what David knew, what you need to know, is that one day in the very near future, you're going to be sitting way up here. And all of those naysayers are going to be sitting underneath you. They're going to be sitting looking to you. They're going to understand that this isn't about anything that you did in the past or any words that they put over you concerning your future. This is about what God's plan was for you in the beginning. The truth is that David could have never been a king worthy of the calling unless he had gone through the valley of the shadow of death. You need to understand that the place that you're going, that big, beautiful, bold promised land that's out there for you, it will never be appreciated. It will never be honored. It will never be loved, and it will never be cherished unless God brings you back from that place of death, the valley of the shadow of death, and he gives you the greatest thing ever. You see, until you've gone through something, you don't understand what it is to get to something. But today, you can know that David had to go through something to get to something, and because of that, David became something. You look at all of the greats in history, everyone who was ever anything, and here's one truth that needs to be noted. They had to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That valley may be different for each and every one of them. I don't know. But this much I do know, is that when you walk through that valley, understanding that God is with you, not fearing the evil that's around you, that his bow, his staff, his sword, his comfort is your comfort, then when you get through that valley, you'll be seated on your throne. You'll be given your placement. You'll be in your calling. You'll be doing the very thing that you were created to do, and all of those who said that you couldn't will be sitting down looking up to you, envying you. Now, this isn't about creating envy in someone else, but it's about understanding that you have a place of honor. All you have to do is press forward, and God will bring you back from the dead.